Hi everyone, I'm Byron. I'm doing a special series. Uh, this one I actually do want people to watch. I would like people to watch this because so no one watches my channel, but I don't care. I mostly do it because I'm playing the video games anyway. It doesn't matter. Um, but I would like people to watch this video. Um, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be reading the Civilopedia entries. Doesn't seem like that much, but you have no option. Whenever I play Civ, I always uh, I always want to read the Civilopedia entries, but I also want to play the game, and I don't want to stop playing the game to read the entries. So right now, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read out on YouTube all of these entries, some of them. Well, the ones that'll be in the title what I'm gonna read, uh, and the way or you could listen to that car honk. the way the way I could the way I would do this if someone else performed this service other than me would be to uh, listen to this while you're playing the game. Although I'm not going to do it in such a good way for that, but it'll be fine. Um, the first thing I'm going to read out this video is going to be the Great Generals. I'm going to go start with Great People. I'm going to do it in this order, the order they're in here. It starts with Boudica. I would like to go in sort of era order, but that's just too hard, and it doesn't matter that much. So I'm just going to go in alphabetical order the way it is in the Civilopedia. But I'm going to start with Great Generals. The next episode will be Great Admirals. Uh, but yeah, so today, Great Generals. And the first one is one I can't pronounce. The very first one. Ethelfade. Ethelfade. Oh, I'm going to be reading them out, doing commentary, a bit of commentary, not much. Probably won't have much for Ethelfade because I never heard of him. And I'm going to read the context first and then the ability because I think that'll just flow a bit better. All right, so Ethelfade. Ethelfade was born around 864 AD, eldest child of the great Alfred the Great, King of Wessex. She took up her father's crusade to drive back the Danish invasions of England and did well enough to be described by English historians as our greatest woman general. In time, Ethelfade was betrothed to her kinsman Ethelred, the ealdorman of Mercia. According to some, on the journey to her wedding, her party was attacked by Danes, perhaps hoping to prevent an alliance between Wessex and Mercia. But the lady directed her escort to an old trench, and so fought off the attackers. Within a few years, Ethelred and Ethelfled had their first and only child, Ethelwyn. It appears that fighting off the Vikings, who had already overrun portions of America, left them little time for other activities. By 884, Ethelfed had joined her husband in directing the campaign, spending much of her time overseeing the rebuilding and crumbling Roman strongholds, and the fortifying of towns as Anglo-Saxon forces recaptured Danish-held territories. According to legend, she was also the prime architect of Saxon strategy, and she personally led American forces into battle as at Chester in 911. This was one of many battles in which Ethelred was not involved. He had been ill since around 902, and after 10 years of battling poor health, finally died. At this point, Ethelfed became the sole ruler of America and thus Lady of America. Ethelfed immediately turned her brother Edward, the elder, who had succeeded Alfred in 899, for support, and together they continued the campaign to drive the Danes out and unify the various English kingdoms. While Wessex acquired London and Oxford, she led campaigns in Wales in 916 and 917, and liberated Derby and Lincolnshire to the north in 918. But on her way to York to accept its pledge of fealty, she died, likely to succumb to one of the now trivial diseases of the time. Alright, and she's in the medieval era, which we knew. from reading it. I should read the era first from now on. Unique ability, retire, grants +2 loyalty per turn for this city. I didn't really see anything in there that really lends itself to that, the +2 loyalty. But I don't know. Passive effect +5 combat, actually +1 movement to medieval and Renaissance era land units within 2 tiles. This effect I think is the same for every Great General, with only the era changing. So Ethelred, I don't know if this is Ethelred the Unready or not, but he's the one at the end of at least one of the Civ games that you're compared to. He's very, very low on the list. I think he's only above Dan Quayle as your score. And it's weird how the very first one is English, and that's the one I'm probably going to have the most trouble pronouncing, is the one who's English, which is the language I supposedly speak. Alright, so let's move on. Oh, and it's a woman. So that was interesting. It said the greatest woman warrior. What about Boudica? I mean, and she's in here, right there. There's Boudica. We're going to get to her. Wow, there's a lot of A's. E. Okay, never mind. And also America. I have heard that, so a theory that America is named after America, this America, and not Amerigo Vespucci. I doubt it, but it's a theory I've heard. Anyway, moving on. You know what? When you actually have to read stuff out, it's always harder to. You always it's that when you realize how hard it is to pronounce. Okay, so this one is Ahmad Shah Massoud of the Information Era. So now, Ahmad Shah, the Lion of Panjshir, was born in Bazrak to a well-to-do Afghani family sometime in 1953. He took the name Massoud as a nom de guerre while leading guerrillas against a Soviet occupation from 1979 through 1989. Following the rise of the Taliban in 1996, Massoud, who initially was willing to work with it to provide stability to the nation, but eventually rejected its fundamentalist interpretation of Islam, returned to armed opposition, forming the United Islamic Front for the Salvation of Afghanistan. For his troubles, he was assassinated on September 9th, probably at the instigation of Al-Qaeda, 2 days before the 2001 attacks in the United States. Wow, that's very interesting. Intelligent, well-read, speaking 5 languages fluently, and devout, Ahmad was an engineering student at Kabul University when he joined Sazman-e-Jawan-e-Musulman, the Muslim youth movement. So he was annoyed when the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan killed the president, his immediate family, and his bodyguards in a violent coup in April 1978 and initiated reforms along Marxist-Leninist lines. Believing that an uprising against the new government would be widely supported, Ahmad launched it in the Panjshir in July 1979, and the Soviet Union sent forces to support the PDPA in December. Although initially Massoud's mujahideen numbered only 5,000, his guerrilla tactics in the rugged mountains and valleys were brilliant. His growing forces ambushed Soviet fuel and supply convoys, enemy patrols, military camps, and hospitals. Attacks on the enemy infrastructure brought reprisals and 6 bloody Soviet offensives into the Panjshir. While the Russians finally withdrew from the morass, Afghanistan collapsed into civil war. At first, Massoud sought to include the extremist Taliban backed by Pakistan, hoping it would help to provide added stability to the peace process. But soon he was again leading the resistance movement in the mountains. By this point, he had become an international spokesperson for Afghani Inspirations of Freedoms. Thus, at the age of 48, Ahmad Massoud became the target of a suicide attack. Alright. Retire. Instantly creates a modern anti-tank unit with 1 promotion level. Makes sense. The Afghanis were not well armed compared to the Soviets, and so their main way was to take out the Soviet supplies. So anti-tank makes a lot of sense. Information, just an information error, not even. Well, I guess it means future. I don't know. Are there? I guess the GDR is a future unit. I didn't think I'd comment much on the actual game, but the GDR is probably an information unit, and there are no future units. But that's interesting. Um, Comments. Yeah, I didn't know about this guy. I didn't watch Charlie Wilson's War. I did watch a documentary, and it may have mentioned him during the documentary about Charlie Wilson. Um, yeah, and he was killed 2 days before. It may have been in line with that. I don't know. I don't know that it was. The 9/11 attacks were planned very quickly, but 2 days before they would have had enough time to know. They would have known it was happening 2 days before. And he took nom de guerre. That means name of war. Opposed to nom de plume, which would mean I don't know what plume means. Nom de plume is when you write it on a book. Nom de guerre, I guess, is when you're taking it for warfare. Yeah. So I knew the general story, but I didn't know this guy. I didn't know him by name, and I really never imagined one guy being in charge of it. So this is an interesting fella. All right, and next one, Anna Nzinga of the Renaissance era. Ruthless and conniving, Nzinga Mbande of Ndongo and Matamba kingdoms of the Mdu, modern Angola, would fight the Portuguese for 35 years. Salacious legends about her abound. That she murdered her older brother to take the throne, that after killing her brother's family she ate their hearts to absorb their courage, that in a pre-battle ritual she had slaves decapitated and drank their blood, that she maintained a 60-man harem, periodically killing some to replace them. While it is likely the Portuguese propaganda may have embellished some of these rumors, a kernel of truth underlay each. Ana de Souza Nzinga Mbande, named Nzinga because the umbilical cord was wrapped around her neck at birth, was born a princess of the Mbundu, circa 1583. She first appears in historical records as an envoy for her brother Ngola at peace negotiations with the invading Portuguese in 1621. But Portugal didn't honor the treaty, and Nzinga assumed the crown to fight them. Either Ngola committed suicide or Nzinga poisoned him, either by killing Ngola's heir immediately after the king's death. After a brief alliance with the Portuguese in order for her to suppress internal and external threats from African tribes, in 1626 Portugal again invaded Ndongo. Fleeing, Nzinga assumed rule in the adjacent kingdom of Matamba by supplanting its queen Mwongo and merged the two. To rebuild her armies, Nzinga offered sanctuary and incentives to runaway slaves and European-trained Africans for their service. She converted to Christianity to gain backing from other European colonial powers, and in 1641 she allied with the Dutch. With reinforcements from the Dutch and from nearby Congo, she led her forces to rout a Portuguese army in 1647. Nzinga then laid siege to the Portuguese colonial capital of Central Africa. Finally, in 1657, weary from the long struggle, she signed a peace treaty with Portugal. She devoted herself to rebuilding her kingdom, to resettling former slaves and soldiers, to internal reforms, until her death in 1663. Retire, gain one envoy. Makes sense, she dealt with people outside. She dealt with Portugal. She dealt with the other tribes. She dealt with the Dutch. She got made an alliance with the Dutch, which is weird because from their perspective, the Dutch would have been a city-state. If this game was made in Africa, this lady would be a main civilization, and the Netherlands would be a city-state rather than the other way around. I'm not even sure these people are a city-state. Nzing, Mbundu, Matamba, I don't know. And another woman. So of the first four, 3 of them are women. And I don't see another woman until down here. Jihan Chen Dark. There's another woman. That might be a 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 woman. I don't know. We'll figure it all out. Boudica. Of the classical era. The first era where you can gain warlords. Not warlords. Warriors. Great generals. Her followers defeated a Roman army. She torched Londinium. Oh, hold on. Alright. Her followers defeated a Roman army. She torched Londinium, leaving a charred layer half a meter thick. According to the Roman historian Tacitus, her troops slaughtered 70,000 civilians in Londinium, Verulinium, and Camulodunum, rushing to cut throats, hang, burn, and crucify. Who was she, and why was she so bloody angry? Snuck a Britishism in there. The first thing to know about Boudica, also Boudicca, Boudicca, Budug, and such, is how little is known about her. What is known comes from the works of 2 Roman historians, Tacitus and Cassius Dio. It seems Boudica's husband, Prasutagus, ruled the Iceni tribe in Britannia as a nominally independent ally of mighty Rome around 60. And she left his kingdom to his daughters and the Emperor Nero to rule jointly in the event of his death. He died, and the Romans promptly ignored the terms, claiming Pradigus had defaulted on his debts. When Queen Boudica objected, she was flogged and her daughters raped, and Rome felt her wrath. Some 100,000 barbarians rallied to Boudica's call for revenge. She marched on Camulodunum, a colonia, a settlement for retired Roman soldiers and their family, in Iceni territory. The garrison, about 200 men, thought the rebels would scatter when confronted. It was a mistake. Having won the battle, the barbarians proceeded to slaughter everyone in town, women, children, the infirm and elderly, and infants. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulus, away campaigning in Wales, upon hearing of the mess, dispatched the 9th Legion, Hispania, to protect Londinium. Boudica's force overran the legion and descended upon the city. Suetonius, meanwhile, regrouped his remaining legions in the west, Midlands. Despite being heavily outnumbered, Suetonius decisively defeated Boudica's horde on the Roman road known as Watling Street. With her followers dead or scattered, Boudica either killed herself, or fell ill and died. I don't actually know much about her. I've converse barbarian units to your control. Makes perfect sense. They called her barbarians, and it's only one charge. So she turns the barbarians into classical medieval. Douglas MacArthur, Atomic Era. Douglas MacArthur led American troops in World War I, commanded Allied forces in the Pacific Theater during World War II, and led United Nations troops in the Korean War. MacArthur earned the Medal of Honor and is one of only 5 individuals to earn the rank of Great General, General of the Army of the United States, in the United States. Okay, let's read that again. is one of only 5 individuals to earn the rank of General of the Army in the United States. MacArthur graduated at the top of his class from West Point, and after World War I would return to become the school's superintendent. During his life, he would also serve as Chief of Staff of the Army for President Herbert Hoover, Field Marshal of the Philippines for President Manuel Quezon, and was encouraged to run for President of the United States himself. In a lifetime of accomplishments, liberating the Philippines from Japanese forces and accepting Japan's surrender during World War II are perhaps his most well known. I can't help but notice how short this is. It's probably the one, might be the one I know most about. There's a great book on him where it talks about him and Truman and their relationship. I read the book because it had the atomic bomb on the cover, and it advertised itself as talking about the inner workings of how the atomic bomb was going to be used after World War II. And it didn't actually talk about it that much. It only talked about things that were talked about publicly at the time. I thought it would go into more detail of stuff like that. Of inner workings of how did they go from using the atomic bomb to realize it's something that should never ever be used. And that's just what I was interested in. But it was an okay book nonetheless. It talked about MacArthur. And this is an interesting. General of the Army. Washington held that post. Someone in World War I held the post. And I don't know who else has ever held the post. It's kind of redundant because you have a chief of staff of the army. So I don't really know why this rank exists and why it's not just chief of staff of the army. Anyway, instantly creates a tank unit with 1 promotion level, grants 1 oil per turn. Really nothing to do with his life, just his era. He wasn't so much to do with tanks. That was Patton. Patton doesn't appear to be in here. Nope. That's interesting. No Patton. And oil, I think there's some oil in the Philippines, but I don't know if that matters. Alright, moving on. Dwight Eisenhower. Atomic era. If administration and planning were the prime ingredients of martial greatness, then Dwight David Eisenhower was surely one of the greatest commanders of all time. Born in Denison, third of 7 boys, Dwight graduated from Abilene High School in 1909. Lacking the funds to attend any normal college, he applied and was accepted to West Point in 1911. Although he graduated, his reputation was that of a violator of academy regulations and less than stellar student. After West Point, Eisenhower experienced several years of professional frustration and disappointment. World War I ended a week before he was scheduled to go to Europe, so he missed all the fun promotions there. But he proved his organizational and political skills by serving as aide to Generals Fox Connor, John G. Pershing, and then to Douglas MacArthur. Eisenhower was assigned to the General Staff in Washington, where he remained until June 1942, helping lay out the American strategy for fighting Germany and Japan. His organizational skills so impressed General George Marshall that he appointed Eisenhower the Supreme Allied Expeditionary Force for the invasion of North Africa. So successful at pushing paper and keeping the egos of Allied commanders in check was he, that he was put in charge of Operation Overlord, the Allied assault on Nazi-occupied Europe. After the war, Eisenhower was briefly president of Columbia University, and then, with the outbreak of the Korean War, took a leave to serve as Supreme Commander of NATO. Upon his return, Ike, having dabbled in the martial and academic spheres, entered the far more ruthless world of politics. He easily beat Democrat candidate Adlai Stevenson for American president in 1952 and 1956, with Richard Nixon as his vice president. Eisenhower proved surprisingly effective and popular. He waged the Cold War, began the reforms of civil rights, continued the New Deal, and even balanced the budget. One of the better presidents in some time, he took on the onerous task of heading Gettysburg College, dying in March 1969. Retire, +5 production towards military units, atomic and information units. So yeah, you never have to retire him because he is effective for all units, but he gives 5% production if you do. I could talk forever about Eisenhower. I guess I will sing the song that I will sing his campaign song though. I like Ike. You like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Ike for president. Ike for president. Ike for president. Um, or just I like Ike. We like Ike. Anyway, Truman actually asked Ike to run for president in '48, and he refused. He only accepted when the isolationist wing of both parties started to gain traction, and he realized that if America withdraws from the world, he's going to lose everything he fought for, and it's just going to dissolve into World War again if America doesn't get involved in keeping the peace. And he was kind of right. And there's another great book called Ike's Bluff, where he talks about this one really does get into his use of nuclear weapons and how Ike thought nuclear weapons should be used. And basically, he thought they should be used. If someone was going to declare war on somebody, nuke them. And he knew how devastating nukes were at this point. And because of how devastating they were, no one's going to make war with anybody. And in fact, during Ike's presidency, I don't think anyone really did. No, the U.S. didn't really do much. The Soviets didn't really expand into Europe or the Middle East. So it was mostly just peace, status quo, for his presidency. At least that's the way I view it. Alright, moving on to El Cid. El Cid, medieval era. As some military leaders have, Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar, known as El Cid, from the Arabic as-Cid, meaning the Lord, has passed beyond history into legend, and like all legendary liberators, he looked to dream the impossible dream and fight the unbeatable foe. Rodrigo's father was a member of the minor nobility of Castile, but it was his mother's relationships that meant the boy was brought up in the household of the king's eldest son, Sancho II. When Sancho assumed the throne in 1065, he appointed the 22-year-old de Vivar as his armiger regis, royal standard bearer, or the king's champion and commander of the royal troops. In 1067, Rodrigo accompanied Sancho on the campaign against the Moorish kingdom of Zaragoza, which made it a tributary of Castile. That same year, Sancho launched a campaign to seize his brother Alfonso VI's kingdom of Leon. Although legend would depict El Cid, the name given to him by the Moors after Zaragoza, a reluctant supporter of the aggression, it is unlikely he had any real scruples, and certainly distinguished himself in the ensuing war. But when Sancho was killed besieging Zamora, El Cid quickly changed his allegiance, and married Alfonso's niece to boot. However, things did not go well at court. Although Cid's apologists would portray him as a blameless victim of conniving nobles, Rodrigo's penchant for arrogance eventually forced him into exile from Leon. Offering his service to the Muslim rulers of Zaragoza, he loyally served the Caliph and his successor for a decade against Lerida and its Christian allies, notably Barcelona and Aragon. Come 1086 and the great Almoravid invasion from North Africa, Alfonso swallowed his ire and recalled El Cid. When the 18-month siege of Valencia finally ended in 1094, El Cid entered it as a conqueror. Had the former ruler burnt alive and brought in a French bishop. Excuse me. He ruled there even-handed, favoring neither Christian nor Muslim until his death in 1099. El Cid, former corps out of a military land unit. Again, seems to be more a relic of the time he was in, rather than to do with his actual story. Yes. So yeah, I didn't actually understand a lot of that. I think that he switched sides a lot, especially this bit here. Alfonso swallowed his ire and recalled El Cid. What? What happened there? Did he switch sides? Again? Or did he conquer? I don't know. Anyway, through conniving, he eventually became a king. Not the king, but a king, all on his own. Of his own right. And he wound up being a good king, even though he was a bloodthirsty general. Bloodthirsty general, good king. There's a trope for you. Yep. Oh, and in the book about Eisenhower, it talks about Clausewitz, who basically says that's how you should be. A bloodthirsty general and a good king. That once you're at war, you don't hold back. And the goal is to avoid war. I need to read that book, Clausewitz on War. Gregory Zhukov, Atomic Era. The most successful and most decorated general of the Soviet Union, Gregory Konstantinovich Zhukov, was born in December 1896 in the backwater, and that's being generous, village of Stretlakova to a peasant family. In 1915, while serving as an apprentice to a furrier in Moscow, he was conscripted to the 106th Reserve Cavalry Regiment and served throughout the war. In a wise career move, he joined the Bolshevik Party immediately after the 1917 October Revolution, serving the party well during the Russian Civil War. For his role in suppressing the 1921 Tambov Rebellion, Zhukov was promoted. The first of several that in May 1933 brought him to command of the 4th Cavalry Division, and in 1937 the 6th Cavalry Corps. Over these years, he became convinced that armored warfare was the way of the future, and developed his own views on how it should be used to batter an enemy into submission. Successfully evading Stalin's purges of the military, Zhukov was tasked with halting the Japanese aggression along the Mongolian-Manchurian border. Arriving in May 1939, in August, Zhukov annihilated the Japanese 23rd Division by outflanking it with armored forces. Returning to Moscow in 1941, he was declared a hero and made Chief of Staff of the Red Army, just in time to see it crushed by the invading Wehrmacht. Zhukov's first task was to save Moscow. Victory. Then halt the Germans at Stalingrad. Victory. Then to push the invaders back into Eastern Europe to capture victory. Then to capture Berlin. Victory. For his exploits, although these came at a great cost for the common Russian soldiers, now Marshal of the Soviet Union, he was termed the general who never lost a battle. However, Zhukov's fame was his undoing, for Stalin wasn't one to tolerate anyone more popular than he. Zhukov was demoted after the war and assigned to a minor posting. Although he experienced a brief rise in stature when Stalin died in 1953, Zhukov spent his remaining days in relative obscurity until his death in 1974. Retire, okay. Plus 50% flanking bonus for all land units. That makes sense. I don't know if anyone's seen the videos that Eastery did of the Russian the Eastern Front of World War II. They're great videos, but flanking was a big deal. Zhukov, very interesting fellow. Yeah, the Manchurian-Mongolian border. I think the Mongolians would have been allied with the Russians at this time. That's why Mongolia is not a part of China, because Stalin would not let Mao invade Mongolia, because they were socialist at the time. And Manchuria would have been a Japanese puppet. So I think it was the border between Mongolia and Manchuria that he's speaking of. Yeah, I didn't know that Russia and Japan were at war at that point. They were not at war by 1941, and they did not declare war on Japan again until after the first atomic bomb fell. So they just went in and invaded Manchuria and went to the 38th parallel of Korea. Okay. Next, I believe, Russian Wehrmacht. Yeah. Gustavus Adolphus, Renaissance era. Gustavus Adolphus, sometimes known as the Lion of the North, was the eldest son of Charles IX and was just short of 17 years of age when he succeeded his father to the Swedish throne in 1611. Since Charles has overthrown Sigismund III, who was also king of Poland, to seize the Swedish crown, the resulting dynastic squabble involved Sweden and Poland in a war that lasted 60 years. Charles had also managed to blunder into a war with Russia and Denmark too after he defaulted on loans. Finally, various Catholic powers were threatening to end Sweden's Lutheran leanings violently. So Gustavus had a few challenges to face. Gustavus managed to negotiate a peace with the Danes in 1613 at the cost of a heavy indemnity. The same year of the election of Mikhail Romanov to the throne of Russia, ended that threat. Mikhail Romanov. I don't know who that is. Although Adolphus decided to take advantage of the upheaval by seizing Russian holdings of Ingrida and Kexholm, thus linking Swedish Finland to Swedish Estonia, in 1917 that war too was over. This left Gustavus and his brilliant Chancellor Oxtrina free to focus on internal reforms, which were included in the restructuring of the Swedish army. The Lion then used it to bludgeon Poland into the truce of the Altmark in 1629, which saw Sweden acquire Livonia on the Baltic. Which was just as well, as Gustavus had become embroiled in the Christian feud known as the 30 Years' War, to support and protect the Protestants in Germany. Gustavus undertook an invasion. He first consolidated the Protestant positions in the north, and then defeated a Catholic army under Tilly that was laying waste to Saxony. In March 1632, he entered Catholic Bavaria, a staunch ally of the Holy Roman Emperor. The subsequent Battle of Lützen was another Protestant victory, but in the process Gustavus Adolphus was shot down by enemy troops. I think I've heard that story before. I don't really know. Instantly creates a bombard with 1 promotion level. Oh, a bombard. Why a bombard? I don't know. He died while besieging a settlement. So maybe it's meant to simulate that. I'll get back to that with Joan of Arc. But maybe it's meant to simulate that, where if he dies outside of a city while it's sieging, that helps. You want him to die sieging a city, is I guess what it's trying to accomplish. If you consider retirement death, which it isn't always. Sometimes it is. Yeah. Was he ever king of Sweden? I don't know. But anyway, these lands he took between Finland and Estonia would have been later taken by Peter the Great, and that's where St. Petersburg is now, I believe. I believe that's what it's talking about. And I didn't know Russia ever held those areas. So I didn't know Russia held those areas before they took them off of Sweden in the first place. Anyway, Hannibal Barca, classical era. Grants one promotion level. Oh, shouldn't read that yet. Born in Carthage in 247 BC, Hannibal of the Great Barca, meaning Thunderbolt family, would give the Romans nightmares for decades and great generals inspiration for centuries. Eldest son of Hamilcar, hero of the First Punic War, at the age of 26, Hannibal was elected to command in Iberia. He soon married Imilce, an Iberian princess, and conquered her ally with most of the Iberian tribes. In 219, he attacked the fortified town of Saguntium, allied to Rome, and the Second Punic War erupted. The following spring, with an army of 100,000 men and 40 elephants, Hannibal marched through the Pyrenees into Gaul, cowed or beat all the Roman allies in his path, sidesteps the army of Publius Cornelius Scipio, and crossed the Alps. Facing inclement weather and attack from indigenous tribes, the crossing is one of the most remarkable military feats in history, although by the time he exited the mountains into northern Italy after 15 days, he was down to some 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and 37 elephants. For the next 3 years, Hannibal rampaged across Italy, inflicting heavy casualties on the enemy at Trebia, Trasimene, and Cannae. He was within miles of Rome itself, but, given his own accumulating losses, was unable to push Scipio out of the way. And Scipio didn't have the forces to decisively win either. That's because the Roman Senate had dispatched legions to attack Carthaginian cities in Iberia and North Africa. Hannibal abandoned his pillaging and returned to defend his homeland. In 202, at the epic Battle of Zama, Scipio decisively defeated Hannibal. After the war, Hannibal spent several years in politics in Carthage, but in 195 the Romans demanded he retire from office, joining the Seleucids in their hopeless fight against Rome. After defeat, he fled to Bithynia. Rome demanded he be turned over, and he fled again to Lycia, where he took his own life in 183 BC. Alright. That's pretty much everything. Everything I knew about him. Hannibal crossing the Alps. Grants one promotion to a military land unit. I guess maybe it should be a mountain climbing promotion or a hill movement promotion. If you just want to role play. So here's my girl, Jeanne d'Arc. A Renaissance era. Renaissance. I would have assumed medieval. But it's Renaissance. I guess that makes sense. Born a peasant in Champagne around 1412, Jeanne, later known as Cécile the Maid, was illiterate and unlearned. Although she was quite skilled at spinning and sewing, and she was singularly pious, embarrassingly so. Around the age of 13, Jeanne became conscious that she was hearing the voices of angels, St. Michael, St. Margaret, St. Catherine, and others. Soon enough, these angels were telling Jeanne that she was to drive the English out of France. The 100 Years' War, which had begun in 1337, was dragging on, and bring the Dauphin, later Charles VII, to Rennes, which was occupied by the English and their Burgundian allies, to be crowned the true King of France. In May 1428, the 17-year-old girl convinced Robert de Baudricourt, French commander at Vauquelin, to take her to French words, Chinon, where Charles' court was in residence, persuading the none-too-bright Dauphin to allow her to accompany the French troops. Attempting to raise the English siege of Orleans in a series of battles, she inspired them to a stunning victory. Although he hesitated to make the commitment, Charles finally entered Rennes accompanied by Jeanne and was crowned King of France in July 1429. The following spring, King Charles ordered Jeanne to Compiègne, to defeat the Burgundians, but during the battle she was thrown from her horse and captured. In the months that followed, the Burgundians got 10,000 francs in ransom. The English executed her as a heretic, and the French had a new patron saint. Retirement bonus, 1 relic. Renaissance and industrial units. That's interesting. That'd be weird to have Joan of Arc leading industrial units. I guess there aren't. This game doesn't have as many units as Civ V, and I think that's a good thing. That it takes longer for the units to get upgraded. But this is actually interesting because the way I know the story, she was actually betrayed by the Dauphin, who sent her off on a suicide mission, sort of. And that was how she died. So in this way, you, the leader, kill her and create a relic, which is weirdly what happened. You push that button to murder her. So that is a very weird thing that happens in this game. It's when you murder Joan of Arc. I wish I could see the battery on my computer. I don't know. Alright, so you... And yeah, she's the Maid of Orleans. She lifted the siege of Orleans. Was that even in here? That's interesting. Because it's only just recently that her trip to Rheims is even focused on. And now here we are, not even mentioning her. Oh, there it is. Attempting to raise the English siege of Orleans. Okay. I forgot reading about that. So she did mention that the siege of Orleans was her main victory. And the trial of Joan of Arc is very interesting. And there's a movie about it, there are books about it, and it is actually very well recorded. And we see her, you can actually look at her signature. There are documents with her signature on it that you can actually look at in the archives of the Catholic Church. So that is just phenomenal. Although 1412, that's actually more recent than I was thinking. But it's before Shakespeare, and we know very little about him. Oh, battery's running low. Okay, here, let me plug in. I'm gonna be sitting in a weird way. So it's not gonna sound as good. I'm not gonna sound as good, but I gotta plug in. I knew this was coming. Alright. Moving on to John Monash. Modern era. I guess named John. One of the First World War's outstanding commanders, John Monash was born in West Melbourne in June 1865. Studied engineering at Melbourne University. Married in 1891. Completed his master's in 1893. And though still in college, was placed in charge of constructing a new railway. But it was his military service that brought John success. Having joined the university's company of the 4th Battalion, Victoria Rifles, in 1884, he became a lieutenant in the North Melbourne Battery in 1887, and was promoted to captain in 1895, major in 1897, and lieutenant colonel in intelligence in 1906, and commanding officer of the 13th Infantry Brigade in 1912. When war came and Australia followed Great Britain into the carnage, Monash was given command of the Australian 4th Infantry Brigade, landing at Gallipoli in April 1915. After that disaster, despite some criticism for his performance there, he was promoted to brigadier and took his men to the killing fields in France. He was soon promoted to Major General and placed in command of the new Australian 3rd Division. In the bloody years following, his troops were involved in several confrontations with the Germans, including Messines, the Third Battle of Ypres, Brudenside, around Armentières. Unlike most of the butchers in command of the Allied and German forces, he actually enjoyed some success. So impressed was the British High Command by his meticulous planning and enthusiasm for military minutiae that in May 1918 Monash was promoted to lieutenant general and given command of the Australian Corps, at that time the largest on the Western Front. After spending 8 months in England overseeing the repatriation of the Australians home, Monash returned to Melbourne himself in early 1919. He entered civilian life and in 1920 became the manager of Victoria's State Electricity Commission, as well as Vice-Chancellor for the University of Melbourne in 1923. He died of heart disease in October 1931, missing World War II. Gained 1 promotion level and 75% combat experience to a military land unit. Yeah, again, just generic. Doesn't seem to have much to do with this story. Didn't know much about this guy. I didn't know this guy existed. An Australian. It was decent general. Marina Raskova, Great General. District and read the bio first. Growing up in a middle-class, musically inclined family in Stalin's Russia was no easy thing. Her father, an opera singer, her mother, a music teacher. It was little wonder the child Malina dreamed of a musical career. But during her teen years, she became more interested in chemistry, likely to the dismay of her parents, dealing with teenage angst. Certainly, chemistry offered more opportunities in the Soviet Union than singing. After graduating from high school in 1929, she obtained an employment in a dye factory as a chemist. There she met and married Sergei Rostov, thus changing her name to Rostova. The next year, Marina began working at the Aeronavigation Laboratory of the Zusavi Air Force Academy in the drafting department, where began her fascination with flight. 2 years later, Rostova joined the Red Army Air Force, becoming the service's first female navigator. Within a year, she had her pilot certificate and was teaching navigation. In a world swept up with enthusiasm and a certain prurient interest for female aviatrix, she joined 2 others, Polina Ospinko and Valentina Grizdubova, and set long-distance flying records, notably the flight of the Rodinia, a modified Tupolev DB-2B in 1938 from Moscow to Komalsk. For this, she and the other 2 was the first woman to receive the Hero of the Soviet Union medal. But when the Germans launched Operation Barbarossa in 1941, Marina's path changed. Because of her status of a hero, she was able to convince Stalin to allow her to form an all-female combat regiment. Although burdened with obsolete planes, as were most Red Army squadrons, she created the 46th Guards Night Bomber Regiment, which became infamous among the Germans as the Night Witches. The 125th Guards Bomber Regiment dropped 980 tons on the enemy, and the 586th Fighter Regiment 38th confirmed kills as bomber escorts. In the bitter skies over Russia, its casualties were high. Rostova herself was killed in January 1943 while attempting to make a forced landing on the banks of the Volga River. District in the Tau gains 1+ air slots. I guess because now you're using women in your army, so now you get 1 extra space, so you now have more space to do it. Yeah, that was a very interesting story. Of all the women that they've added, a lot of them were just so they could add women. Yeah. Especially given that 2 of them are British. So obviously they're just pulling from what little they can find. And English reserves will be the 2 British ones. Documents that are in English. So you're going to get more English speakers. But yeah, the only women I think I would have so far is Joan of Arc and this one. But Boudica's famous, but I don't think she really should be. It's just Anglocentrism, which is why she's famous. But let's stop talking about that. Napoleon Bonaparte, the one, the only industrial era. Everyone in civilization has heard of Napoleon, so this historical entry will skip over the boring bits and get right to the bloodletting. Born in Corsica, that's not a boring bit. Napoleon de Bonaparte later Frenchified his name. Was a second lieutenant in the artillery regiment La Frere at the time of the French Revolution. Since France was soon at odds with every European monarchy, there were lots of chances for advancement. He distinguished himself by defeating Austria and Italy in a brilliant campaign, culminating in the Treaty of Campo Formio, and then convinced the revolutionary government to strike in England by invading Egypt. But the political situation in France was unstable, and Napoleon returned to Paris, giving himself the ultimate promotion in the coup of 18 Brumaire, in which the French directorate was overthrown. In 1804, he made himself emperor. For the next decade, Napoleon fought off the great and lesser powers of Europe: Austria, Prussia, Russia, England, Spain, Portugal, Naples, Sweden, Saxony, and everyone else. Did he fight off Russia? And an attempt at security for France and for himself, and beat down each coalition that was cobbled together among former enemies. His battles were legendary, his campaigns still studied by military men. His organizational skills and logistical innovations allowed the motivated French armies and their growing lists of allies to take on all comers in all corners of Europe. But even Napoleon couldn't overcome attrition, and eventually his stubborn enemies, who just wouldn't stay beaten, turned the tide. In Russia and Spain, the French suffered losses in men and materiel that couldn't be replaced, and the coalition allies even learned to cooperate, as at Leipzig in 1913 and at Waterloo in 1815. Even in defeat, so feared was Napoleon that the British imprisoned him on the remote island of St. Helena, where he died in 1821 at the age of 51. Retire. Forms an army out of a military land unit. That makes a bit more sense because he organized things and he got them together. So that makes a little bit of sense. I'm not sure he ever fought. Did he ever fight against? I guess so. I guess the Battle of the Five Emperors, I think it's called. I think they were all fighting Napoleon, but he sort of respected the Russian emperor. Or it was Battle of the Three Emperors. I think it was the Three Emperors, because Karl Fritz, Alexander, and Napoleon. I think it was Karl Fritz. I don't remember the Austrian guy. Yeah, it was Russia eventually beat him. He beat all the other guys except England. Kind of Spain. He beat Spain. Let's say except for the defeat. He won, but he lost a lot of men doing it. Did he beat Sweden? Did he beat Portugal? Naples? I don't know. Rani Lakshmi. Industrial era. That's interesting. Born November 1828 in the holy city of Varanasi, she was married to the Maharaja of Jhansi in May 1842. Thus renamed Lakshmi in honor of the goddess and made our Rani. Unfortunately, her doting father had her trained in fencing. Unconventionally, her doting father had her trained in fencing, riding, shooting, and even reading and writing, all martial skills that would serve her later. In 1853, upon the death of the Maharaja, the earlier passing of the couple's only son, the British East India Company, typical Anglo-greed, invoked the doctrine of lapse and annexed the state. A year later, the Rani was given an unwanted pension and ordered to depart the palace fortress. Lakshmi attempted to seek legal restitution of her crown, but given that this was in British courts, without success. Somewhat fortuitously, it was this point that the entire Indian army mutinied in June 1857, taking advantage of the chaos. 5 days later, the Rani escaped from house arrest, declared open revolt, and attacked the British fort of Jhansi. Although her role has been debated, the British population in the kingdom was massacred to the last child. While the fighting raged across India, Lakshmi prepared her army. In early 1858, General Sir Hugh Rose invaded, bringing a few thousand regulars and many cannons. The Rani managed to hold on for 2 weeks until a rebel relief column of some 20,000 men from an adjacent province approached. Unfortunately for the Rani, the British cannon blew apart her combined force. Having evacuated as many of her people as possible from the city and fortress, she led the survivors to join the hopeless effort to overthrow British rule. In June 1858 in Gawar, she was killed in a stiff little battle with the 8th Hussars Regiment. Fulfilling her dying wish that her body not fall in the hands of the spiteful English, her loyal bodyguards built a funeral pyre on the spot. Instantly creates a cavalry unit with 1 promotion level. Okay. Makes a bit of sense. A little bit interesting. It's interesting that women keep taking up resistance against empires. Boudica. I think they're almost all defensive, except Ethelfled. They've all been defensive in nature. The women. Whereas the others have attacked. That's interesting. Anything else to say? So cavalry, not really related to this, but cavalry was used well into World War II. And they knew that it wasn't a good idea. They didn't have other options, and they always used it well. Like they never. There was maybe once where they charged into machine guns, but then they learned quickly not to do that. But they continued to use cavalry, and they used it when they knew it would work. Samori Touré, modern era. Samori Touré was born around 1830 in the Milo River Valley in Guinea. The son of Jula traders, in the 1850s, Samori joined the military forces of Medina to liberate his mother, who had been captured in a slave raid by King Sori Burma, mastering the firearms that were transforming warfare in West Africa. He acquired yet more martial skills in serving the local chieftains in their petty affairs before setting out on his own. Raising and commanding his own army in 1878, the charismatic Touré declared himself Fama, monarch of the Mandinka Empire, with his capital at Bistambugu. By the early 1880s, his rule had spread from Mali to the borders of British Sierra Leone, the Sudan to the east, and the Côte d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, I forget how to pronounce it in French, the Ivory Coast and Liberia to the south, reaching its apogee in 1887. Samori later took the title of Almani, a title reserved for Muslim leaders. But in the 1884 Berlin Conference partitioned Africa among the European powers, and the French soon cast a covetous eye on Mandinka. Although his tribesmen initially defeated the French between 1885 and 1889, Touré was pushed steadily deeper into the West African interior. In 1890, he reorganized his army, signed a treaty with the British, and from them obtained relatively modern weapons. But in December 1891, the rapacious French were at it again, overrunning the major cities of the religion, leaving death and desolation in their wake, such that the exodus of the entire Mandinka kingdom, at least the survivors, eastward resulted. Meanwhile, Touré's own forces were conquering large tracts of the Ivory Coast, and in 1893 established a new kingdom with Kong as its capital. Despite his scorched earth strategy, the French pressed onward. As Samori took up positions in the Liberian forests, however, famine and desertion weakened his forces, such that he was captured by the French in September 1898. Exiled to Gabon, he died of pneumonia 2 years later. Simon Bolivar. Oh, comments. I gotta go. Instantly creates a Spec Ops unit with 1 promotion level. Spec Ops? That makes no sense. He was African. He died before 1900. I don't mean he was African and that Africans can't be advanced, but it was, when Africa was. Never mind. I meant he was one of the several Africans fighting off European powers, which would have only been modern and atomic. Okay, Spec Ops is neither. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Ability creating a Spec Ops unit. It doesn't seem to make much sense, but I think Spec Ops is a paratrooper unit. I don't remember. But yeah, pretty. Because by the time you can either have it in the modern era, which is going to be so you'll be able to take on tanks at that time, or you can wait and just free unit when you're done using them. Simon Bolivar. Simon Jose Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad Bolivar y Palacios was born in July 1783 in Caracas to a family rich from gold and copper mines in Venezuela. Upon the death of his parents, he was sent to Spain in 1799 to gain an education. Besides a dislike for the heavy-handed Spanish attitude towards colonials, Simon acquired a young wife, Maria Teresa Rodriguez del Toro y Alesa, in 1802. Returning to Venezuela with her husband, she died from yellow fever, leaving Bolivar free to return to Europe and make the acquaintance of Napoleon, whom he came to admire. But when Napoleon made Joseph king of Spain, Bolivar joined the resistance movement in 1810 to make Venezuela independent. He was shortly thereafter sent to Britain by the revolutionary junta to gain support for the Latin American fight for freedom. Junta, or Junta? I don't know which one it is. But things did not go well back in Venezuela, and in May 1813, Bolivar led an invasion to wrest control of the country from the Spanish. Thus began the Campaña Admirable, which resulted in the creation of the brief Venezuelan Republic later in the year. Bolivar was hailed across the continent as El Libertador, but the ensuing civil war in his homeland forced him into exile in Jamaica, where he drafted La Carta de la Jamaica, an influential treatise outlining his vision for a free Central and South America. Although he failed in his efforts to get the backing of either Great Britain or the United States, he did manage support from Haiti. After 3 years of indecisive defeats and victories, Bolivar displayed his brilliance in military affairs by his campaign to capture New Granada in 1819. There followed a string of revolutionary successes by El Libertador, unmatched in the course of civilization. In 1821, the nation of Gran Colombia, what is now Venezuela, Colombia, Panama, and Ecuador, was created under Bolivar's leadership. In 1824, he liberated Peru, followed by the creation of Bolivia in 1825. After a brief stint as dictator of Gran Colombia, Bolivar resigned his post in 1830, dying of tuberculosis in December of that year. Grants 4 loyalty per term for this city. Would have been cool if it was something to do with Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid at the end of that movie where they go into the Bolivian army. It'd be very cool if they did something to do with that. I don't know what it would be. Plus 4 loyalty. How does that relate to the Simon Bolivar? Was anyone people excessively loyal to him? I don't think so. In fact, as soon as well, I guess this is him becoming dictator. I guess what that means. So retirement is him becoming the dictator and imposing loyalty. Sudirman, Atomic Era. Born in a village in central Java in 1916, Sudirman took up studies at the Dutch native school in Protocol, and then, being a devout Muslim, moved a Muhtarama teacher training college in Sukrata. Dropping out of teacher training, he nevertheless became a teacher and later headmaster in 1935 in Chilacap, continuing his profession until shortly after the Japanese occupation of the islands in 1942. He volunteered to be trained as a battalion commander in PETA, Pembla Tanah Air, in the Homeland Defense Army established by the Japanese. He took command of a battalion based in the Baianumas in 1944 and loyally put down a revolt by fellow soldiers. When Japan's defeat became inevitable in 1945, Sukarno and Hatta declared Indonesia's independence in August and formed the TKR, Tendrika Keselamatan Rakyat, or People's Security Army, in October, composed mostly of ex-PDA units. While many of the PDA units had been forcefully disbanded by the Japanese, Sudirman had kept his Baramas-based regiment together and even persuaded the retreating Japanese to turn their weapons over to him, resulting in an arms cache was so large that he was able to distribute arms to other nearby Japanese groups, who thus pledged allegiance to him. He became the best armed and best organized military command in Indonesia, and in the aftermath of World War II, Sudirman in turn pledged his allegiance to Sukarno. In November 1945, the election to decide the commander-in-chief of the two nations' military, Sudirman was chosen. In December, while waiting to be confirmed, he led a coordinated attack on Dutch and British forces in Ambarwa, driving them all the way to Semarang, from which the British soon evacuated. For the next 5 years, although suffering from tuberculosis, he led guerrilla actions against the Dutch, including the brilliant defense of Yogyakarta, then headquarters of the Republic of Indonesia. Sudirman died in Magelang in January 1950, just a month after the Dutch formally transferred sovereignty to the new republic. Great story. Grants 6 loyalty per turn for this city. I guess that maybe symbolizes him handing out the weapons. Yeah, didn't know anything about this guy either. Outside of China, Europe, and America, I'm not going to know much before of any of this stuff. Speaking of China, Sun Tzu. Classical era. Know thyself, know thy enemy. 1,000 battles, 1,000 victories. Words to live by, especially one that has pretensions of being a great general. However, historians aren't quite sure whose words these may be. The difficulty in ascertaining Sun Tzu's historicity comes from the early Chinese works which mention him. The Spring and Autumn Annals, the records of the Grand Historian, both are internally inconsistent, laden with inaccuracies, self-serving, and marked by conflation of actual events. While these two sources disagree as to where Sun Tzu was born, his family, his education, and early life, both state that he was active as a strategist serving Helu of Wu beginning around 512 BC. At the decisive Battle of Boju, Sun Tzu is said to have led the Wu forces. Supposedly, his victories for the Wu over the Chu inspired him to set down his precepts in The Art of War. The directly translated title is Master Sun's Rules for the Army.
It has been argued that The Art of War is actually a compilation of several works on strategy that dates to the later Warring States period, or that it was written by Sun Tzu's descendant Sun Bin, also a famous scholar of military arts. Although certainly the accepted version incorporates commentary from later philosophers such as Li Chen and Du Mu, whatever the case, the approach to military strategy therein is an implicitly Taoist one. Unlike Western thinkers, Sun Tzu argues that force, Li, is not the center of military strategy. Instead, victory and defeats are psychological states. War is not so much a matter of destroying the enemy materially and physically, although that certainly helps, but of unsettling the enemy psychologically. And of course, when you retire him, he creates the great work, The Art of War, which is a great work of writing. So it had my interesting fact in there, actually, that it's based on Taoism, and that the Taoists view that just it is what it is, just let it be, sort of Taoism. And that's in The Art of War a lot, where, battles are won before they are fought. There's no real need to fight the battle. It's actually kind of a Taoist way of looking at things. So yeah, unfortunately they took my fact. I've read this book. It's a good book. I see no reason to believe it was written by one man. Not from what I've read. I wonder. I'm gonna do it. I have with me an anthology of Taoist literature, and I doubt it, highly doubt it, but I wonder if this is in there. So I'm just gonna pull this out of the drawer. Oh, this big old book, and we will see. Okay. Hinduism, Buddhism, Taoism. Song. Sway. Han. Dawn of Taoism, Zhou Dynasty. Mozi. The Way. Zhuangzi. Hulianzi. Neyi. Suyakuten. Nope. Simatan. Well, it doesn't have that, but it does have Sima Tan. Who's Sima Chin's father, and he actually helped write the Siji, the Records of the Grand Historian. So Sima Tan started that book. So that's interesting. The essential points of the 6 lineages of thought. So yeah, that's quite interesting. But I don't see anything of Art of War in here. They should have put it in here. Let's see if there's anything at all. I'm going to read them all and just see if there's anything. Master chose words. Nope. I'm reading it very quickly. I might miss it even if it is in here. I'm going to skip to the end. See at the end it comes back. The Qing. No. Republican era. Alright. The Dow, Tennyson, Oscar Wilde, Carl Jung, Monastic Life, Reactionary, Why don't superhero reactionary Taoist cults? Buddhists and Taoists at Mount Nanyu welcome the people's communes. That's interesting. George Harrison, RZA, two ritual documents. Nope, I see nothing in here at all. Referencing the art of war, any sort of warfare to do with Taoism. But it would have been very interesting if it was. Anyway, on to the next one. Timur. Timur, frequently known as Timur the Lane or Timurlane in the West, was a Turkish Mongol warlord. of the 12th century, a redoubtable, ruthless ruler who rose from the humble origins to establish a dynasty in Iran and Central Asia at the time of his death, leading to an era of flourishing culture afterwards. He was born in 1336 near Samarkand. It was a fractious part of the world in a fractious era. Less than a century previously, Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire swept Central Asia and subdivided the region into successor kingdom. Timur was born in the Chagatai Khanate, descended from a Mongol group that settled in the area that is Uzbekistan today. Timur started as a leader of a small nomadic group, and by employing the same mix of unconventional mounted warfare, political intrigue, diplomatic negotiation, and terrifying reputation as Genghis Khan, ascended to rule of all Transsaxonia before he was 40. He spent the rest of his life at war. Scroll down. Oopsies. Timur claimed to be the restorer of the Mongol Empire, and his list of conquests and successful campaigns is impressive. He began against Persia, and then went on to the conquests in northern India, Russia, Georgia, Mesopotamia, Syria, and Egypt before dying at the start of his campaign against China in 1405. But he was no magnanimous conqueror. Timur's campaigns are famous for brutality and bloodshed. He had slaved the artisans of the city of Aleppo and hauled them in chains back to the capital of Samarkand. He left the cities of Delhi and Baghdad as ruins. Contemporaneous writers accused him of creating towers and pyramids out of the skulls of his enemies, which seems not implausible. He had lavished his capital of Samarkand during his lifetime, despite spending very little of his time there. After his death, the city became a center of arts and culture, infused with controversies, contributions by the Seljuk Turks, such as architecture, and Persia, such as arts and letters, as well as its long tradition of trade and commerce. His descendants held territory conquered for most of his centuries before the Timurid Empire collapsed in fratricide and internal strife. In the Nesrin wisdom stories, Timur sometimes appears as the cruel, powerful foil to Nesrin's simply folksy wisdom. Interested persons are encouraged to read them. Well, that's something I feel like I should add, but I don't know these stories. But that's sort of something I've been adding. Medieval era. Grants 1 promotion level and plus 25 combat experience to 8 military land unit. Medieval. Okay, so I guess the Renaissance starts for them in 1400. Yeah, I vaguely knew of him, very vaguely. Alright, on to the very last one. Fija Wilmalaranet. Born in August 1940 AD in Colombo, Varnigirma Irith Valikar Mendes Wamaret, or just Vijaya, was Sri Lanka's most, or realistically only, distinguished general. He spent his career training officers and commanding the forces fighting the freedom, or depending on one view, terrorist movement known as the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam. Wimatari joined the Gurmu Watch of the Sri Lankan army as a subaltern in 1961 and trained in the methods of jungle warfare in Malaysia. Later, he would graduate from British Army Staff College at Camberley. From 1970 through 1991, Vaya was the course commander for the Sri Lankan officer cadets in counterinsurgency and jungle warfare, in the process of rising to the rank of Major General. In 1987, he was tasked with forming the new Gajava Regiment to put his training into practice. His first chance to do so came with the operation to rescue troops trapped by FTTE in the Jaffna Fort in 1990, and the follow-up amphibious operations Balavagaya in 1981 to clear the Elephant Pass of rebels. His final appointment was as commander of security forces, Jaffna, Early in 1992, together with other commanders, Vijaya was in charge of planning Operation Final Countdown to clear the northern peninsula of FTTE. In August, Wimarlanti sought to finalize plans by personally reconnoitering the region. I don't know what that word means. Reconnoitering the region. Accompanied by Major General Kabekadua, commander of the Northern Sector Troops, and Commodore Shemaya, commander of the Northern Naval Area, it turned out to be a poor decision, although certainly in keeping with its hands-on notions of military command. As they were driving back to be airlifted by helicopter, the Land Rover they were traveling in hit a landmine. Wilmarashta was killed instantly. Grants 1 promotion level and plus 100% combat experience to the military land unit. I had a professor from Sri Lanka, and he said it was pretty bad. Just bombs going off all the time. So, this is the last guy. Maybe the last guy chronologically as well. Because the early 90s, that's after the Mahashadin is happening, even though he died before the other guy. Yeah. So it's been fun. I will come back later with Great Admirals. This might be the first one. Artemisa. She might be first. Yeah, I will be back. Bye.